The Crocodile Cafe in Seattle, October 1991. A small venue that held maybe 200 people on a good night. Most nights it was half that. The walls were covered with graffiti, the floor sticky with spilled beer, and the sound system had seen better decades. But it was real. It was honest. And on this particular Tuesday night, it became the setting for a conversation that would change how one man understood music forever. Danny Morrison sat at the far end of the bar, nursing his third whiskey. At 67, he'd seen it all. He'd played guitar with legends in the 60s, toured with bands whose names still appeared on classic rock radio. His weathered hands had crafted riffs that influenced a generation. But now in 1991, he felt like a relic in a world that had forgotten what real music was supposed to sound like. The local newspapers had been full of stories about something called grunge. Kids with unwashed hair playing guitars that sounded like they were broken. No melody, no craftsmanship, just noise and angst. And leading this musical apocalypse, according to every article Danny read, was a skinny kid named Kurt Cobain. It's not music, Danny had told the Seattle Times reporter just last week. What these kids are doing, what this Cobain character represents, it's the death of everything we built. Real music had structure. It had beauty. These grunge kids killed it all. The interview had run with the headline, "Rock Veteran Says Grunge Killed Real Music." Danny felt vindicated. Someone needed to say it. Tonight, he just wanted to drink in peace. The Crocodile was playing host to some local bands, the kind of acts that would normally send Danny heading for the door. But his apartment felt too empty, and the whiskey here was cheaper than buying a bottle to drink alone. The first band finished their set to scattered applause. Danny barely looked up from his glass. More noise. More evidence that music was dying. Between sets, the venue settled into that particular kind of quiet that comes before the next wave of sound. People talked in small groups, ordered drinks, checked their watches. The bartender changed the background music to something softer, some folk song Danny didn't recognize. That's when he noticed the figure at the other end of the bar. Flannel shirt hanging loose over a white t-shirt, blonde hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days, jeans with holes that weren't fashionable, just worn. The kid was maybe 24, thin, hunched over a beer he wasn't really drinking. His eyes were focused on nothing in particular, that 1,000-yard stare Danny had seen before in musicians who carried too much weight. Someone at a nearby table pointed at the kid and whispered something to their friend. The friend turned to look, then whispered back. Danny caught a fragment. That's him. Recognition hit Danny like a cold wave. Kurt Cobain, the destroyer of real music, was sitting 20 feet away, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Danny's whiskey suddenly tasted bitter. Here was the enemy of everything he'd spent his life building, drinking cheap beer in a dive bar like some kind of regular person. The audacity of it made Danny's hands clench around his glass. He should leave. Walk away. Let the kid drink in peace and pretend this night never happened. Instead, Danny found himself standing up, walking across the sticky floor, pulling out the bar stool next to Kurt Cobain. "You're him," Danny said. It wasn't a question. Kurt looked up. His eyes were blue, tired, older than his face suggested. "Depends who you're looking for." "Kurt Cobain, the one who killed real music." A pause. Kurt's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. "You read the Times," Kurt said quietly. "I said those words." "Yeah, I figured." Kurt took a small sip of his beer. "Danny Morrison, right? You played with the Electric Prophets in '68. Danny blinked. The kid knew who he was. "You know my work?" "Midnight Highway was one of the first songs I learned to play." Kurt's voice was soft, matter of fact. "Your guitar work on that track, it's beautiful. Taught me more about melody than most guitar teachers ever could." The response threw Danny off balance. He'd come over here ready for a fight and instead found appreciation. It didn't fit the narrative he'd built in his head about who Kurt Cobain was supposed to be. "If you learn from real music," Danny said, recovering his anger, "then how did you end up doing what you do? All that noise and screaming, where's the craftsmanship in that?" Kurt nodded slowly, like he'd expected the question. "What do you hear when you listen to our music? Chaos. Anger without purpose. Volume instead of skill. And what did you hear in your music? In the Electric Prophets? Danny straightened. Melody, structure, real emotion expressed through technical mastery. Music that meant something. Music that meant something to who? The question hung in the air between them. Danny opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Kurt wasn't being confrontational. He was genuinely asking. To everyone, Danny finally said, real music speaks to everyone. Kurt was quiet for a long moment, turning his beer bottle in his hands. The condensation left small puddles on the bar. Can I show you something? Kurt asked. Before Danny could respond, Kurt was standing up, walking toward the small stage area where someone had left an acoustic guitar. The conversations around the bar gradually quieted as people noticed Kurt moving toward the microphone. Danny felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd started something, and now it was going to play out in front of a room full of people. Kurt adjusted the microphone stand, picked up the acoustic guitar, and sat down on the edge of the stage. No introduction, no explanation. He just started tuning, each string adjusted with the kind of precision that only comes from years of practice. The room was completely quiet now, everyone watching, waiting. Kurt's fingers found the strings. The first chord rang out, clear and true. Then the second. The progression was simple, elegant, built on the kind of melodic foundation Danny recognized from decades of playing. But it wasn't a Nirvana song. It was something else. Something that sounded like home. Kurt began to sing. His voice, without the distortion and volume of his electric performances, revealed itself as something entirely different. Rich, controlled, vulnerable. The lyrics weren't the angry slogans Danny expected. They were poetry, stories about loneliness and connection, about feeling lost in a world that moved too fast, about finding beauty in broken things. Each line was crafted with the kind of care Danny thought this generation had forgotten how to apply. But more than the words, it was the way Kurt sang them. Every phrase carried weight. Every pause held meaning. This wasn't performance. This was confession. As the song continued, Danny found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. The kid was good. Not just good, he was gifted. The kind of natural musician Danny had seen maybe 5 times in his entire career. Kurt's fingers moved across the fretboard with the confidence of someone who understood the instrument completely. The melodies he created were complex without being showy, emotional without being manipulative. Every note served the song, not the ego of the player. The song built slowly, layers of meaning accumulating with each verse. Kurt's voice grew stronger, more present, but never loud. He didn't need volume. The emotion in the performance filled the room more completely than any amplifier ever could. Danny realized his hands were shaking. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't the destroyer of real music. This was someone who understood music at a level that made Danny question everything he thought he knew about the current generation of artists. When the song ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of people who had just experienced something they weren't sure they deserved to hear. Kurt set the guitar aside and looked directly at Danny. That's what I hear in our music, Kurt said quietly. Not the noise, not the chaos. The same thing you heard in yours. People trying to connect, trying to say something true in a world that makes it hard to tell the truth. Danny couldn't speak. The assumptions he'd built his recent worldview on were crumbling in real time. Your music spoke to people who needed to hear that the world could be beautiful, Kurt continued. Our music speaks to people who need to hear that it's okay to feel broken. Different audience, same purpose. The bartender had stopped what he was doing. The conversations that had been happening around the room hadn't resumed. Everyone was still processing what they just heard. I don't understand, Danny said, his voice barely a whisper. If you can play like that, sing like that, why the distortion? Why the volume? Why hide it? Kurt looked down at his hands. Same reason you used electric guitars instead of acoustic ones, I imagine. The message required a different delivery. The kids who need to hear what we're saying, they won't listen to a folk song, but they'll listen to 3 chords and the truth delivered loud enough to cut through all the other noise in their heads. Danny felt something break inside his chest. Not break like breaking down, break like breaking open. The craftsmanship, he said slowly, it's still there, just applied differently. Music evolves, Kurt said. Has to. Your generation took blues and folk and created rock and roll. We took rock and roll and created something else. But the foundation, the reason we do it, that doesn't change. Danny looked around the room. Young faces, old faces, all of them still caught up in what had just happened. All of them connected by the same thing that had connected people to music since the beginning of time. I was wrong, Danny said. The words came out louder than he intended, carrying across the quiet room. About you, about all of it. Kurt shook his head. You weren't wrong about what you value. Melody matters. Structure matters. Beauty matters. You just didn't see how we were trying to honor those things in our own way. Danny felt the wetness on his cheeks before he realized he was crying. In front of a room full of people, in front of the kid he'd publicly dismissed as the enemy of everything he loved, he was crying. I spent so long being angry, Danny said, thinking music was dying, thinking what I'd built didn't matter anymore. It matters more than you know, Kurt said. Every guitar player in Seattle grew up learning your riffs, your songwriting. We're not replacing what you did, we're building on it. The bartender approached with 2 fresh drinks, Danny's whiskey, Kurt's beer. He set them down without saying a word, just nodded at both men like he understood something important had happened. Danny took a sip of his whiskey. It tasted different now, better. Play it again, someone called from the back of the room. Please. Kurt looked at Danny. You mind? Danny shook his head. I'd like to hear it again. Kurt picked up the guitar. This time he looked at Danny while he played, and Danny listened, really listened, not for what was wrong with it, but for what was right with it. Everything was right with it. When the song ended the second time, the applause was longer, warmer. People approached the stage to thank Kurt, to ask about the song, to tell him what it had meant to them. Danny watched the interactions, saw the genuine connection between performer and audience, saw the same thing he'd chased his whole career, just expressed in a language he hadn't learned to speak. What was that song? Danny asked when the crowd had thinned. Something I've been working on, Kurt said. Probably won't make it onto any album. Too quiet for what people expect from us. It should, Danny said firmly. That song, it's real music. By any definition. Kurt smiled for the first time that night. It changed his whole face. Made him look like the 24-year-old he actually was, instead of someone carrying the weight of the world. Maybe I'll record it, Kurt said. Simple. Just voice and guitar. See what people think. They'll love it, Danny said. Anyone with ears will love it. The next band started setting up their equipment. Kurt stood up, prepared to give up the stage. Thank you, Danny said, for this, for changing my mind, for showing me I was thinking too small. Thank you for caring enough to be angry, Kurt replied. People who don't care about music don't get upset when they think it's changing. Your anger came from love. I respect that. They shook hands. 2 generations of musicians, finding common ground in a dive bar in Seattle. Danny watched Kurt walk back to his spot at the bar, watched him blend back into the crowd like he'd never been on the stage at all. But the impact of those few minutes would stay with Danny for the rest of his life. 6 months later, Danny read about Nirvana's appearance on MTV Unplugged. He watched the broadcast and heard echoes of that night at the Crocodile. The same vulnerability. The same craftsmanship delivered without pretense. He called the Seattle Times the next day. I need to correct something, he told the reporter who'd interviewed him before, about what I said about grunge, about Kurt Cobain. The follow-up article ran with a different headline. Rock veteran, I was wrong about grunge, music lives on. In the piece, Danny described that night at the Crocodile without mentioning Kurt by name, respecting the deeply private nature of their encounter. But his message was clear. Danny started going to many more local shows after that memorable night. Not to judge, but to listen, to understand what each new voice was trying to say. Music truly wasn't dead, it had just changed clothes. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, you got to witness the moment when someone showed you that change didn't have to mean destruction. It could mean evolution, it could mean hope.